Okay, in this video, I want to walk through chapter 1 and then give a little heads up for you on chapter 2. Not going to summarize every detail from our reading, but I do want to point out some places where Longenecker's categories are helpful, some places where the discussion connects to what we've already been saying about oral tradition, and a few places where I think we need to ask some questions about Longenecker's conclusions. As you work through pages 6 and 7, make sure you're able to articulate these 4 basic points that Jewish interpreters, no matter how different their exegetical methods were, that these 4 points that they agreed on. This is kind of helping us see the interpretive world that was shared by the authors of the New Testament. Then on chapter 8, I was really kind of interested in Longenecker's discussion on the Septuagint, how he basically said that the Septuagint should not be looked on as a theological commentary. It should not be used as a primary source for a knowledge of the hermeneutical procedures of the day. That we should not look at the translation of the Septuagint and how the Septuagint makes some theological interpretations in its translation choices, that we should not see that as a theological commentary or a primary source for a knowledge of the hermeneutical procedures of the day. He says to do so is an overstatement of the facts. And I just find that kind of a difficult pill to swallow, especially when Longenecker is going to use the Targums as evidence for hermeneutical procedures of the day, when the Targums began, some of them during Christ's life, right around the time of Christ, but then a lot of them really advancing after, growing all the way up into the era of Islam, like 6th century. So why would the Septuagint, that was formed, 300 to 250 BC to 200 100 BC, why would that not be as good, or maybe even better, of a look at the hermeneutical world of the Jewish time preceding Jesus, which leads into the hermeneutics of the apostles? And as we've seen, looking at Habakkuk in our videos, we've processed through some of the content of Habakkuk. We saw that the Septuagint had some very interesting theological takes on the Masoretic Hebrew of Habakkuk, that wasn't contrary to the Hebrew text, but perhaps could have represented ideas and interpretive traditions of the time. So, I think the Septuagint is literally an insight into how that culture was interpreting and translating its textual traditions. You can read Longenecker, and you can listen to me and make your own decision. But I think that the Septuagint should be considered an important witness to the interpretive tradition surrounding the traditions standing behind the text of the Old Testament that are quoted, alluded to, and echoed in the New. On page 14, it's good to look at and process those four headings that Longenecker lists of literalist interpretations, midrashic interpretations, pesher interpretations, and allegorical interpretations. And of course, those categories of midrash and pesher are very fluid as you read through chapter 2. If you haven't already, you'll see that there's different ways to define those terms. And I was really interested in the discussion on the, was it res pesher, like of the mystery, and how that was taken from some of the interpretive approaches in Daniel, interpreting the dreams or the writing on the wall, and then that was kind of applied in the Qumran community. I found that very, very interesting. But have those basic categories in your mind. Yes, we can't nail down everything systematically perfectly, but having general categories is helpful as we process through how the apostles were carrying on some of the Jewish interpretive practices of the time. On page 20, make sure you read through a couple times the seven rules of exegesis associated with Hillel. I'm not going to quiz you. There's no quizzes or tests in the class. However, I do want to see in the papers that you write for this class that you are engaging the content of the course, and in your forums, your forum posts. I want to see that you're engaging with specific critical data of the chapters, and so you'll want to talk about literalist, midrash, pesher, and allegorical interpretive approaches. You'll want to talk about these 7 rules. You really want to engage the content of the class, not just kind of conjure up your own thoughts and ideas about the subject. I'm also find it very interesting that it was the later periods where some of the more fanciful interpretations developed, right? So you had Hillel with his 7, like in the 1st century CE, and then in the 2nd century came the 13 rules from Rabbi Akiba, right? No, from Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, in opposition to the innovations of exegesis of Rabbi Akiba. And then later after that came, I don't know how to say this guy's name, Rabbi Eliezer ben Josi HaGalili. Anyway, he brought out 32 rules, and his rules included like the computation of numeric values for letters, secret alphabets, substitution of letters. Like, this is like, I don't know about you. I mean, I don't do the TikTok, but I've seen some, like a grown up, sometimes I see TikTok videos on Instagram Reels. And some of that TikTok theology is just crazy. I'm pretty sure I saw one where they were using the letters of Bereshit to say that in the beginning you have the letters had secret meanings. And so the meanings of the letters basically translate into something like the Father sends his Son as an atoning sacrifice for mankind, or something like that. And it's just like, do you really think that the text that we have, and we don't have a text that is solidified enough. Like the text is we see the text fluid. As we look at the multiple manuscripts, we don't have texts that are consistent enough to say that every letter that was written down in the Hebrew, as if there was some kind of like perfect original, like we saw in looking at Habakkuk. That's not how they treated the text, right? That there would have to be like every letter in Hebrew perfectly written exactly that way for this numeric value counting system, every letter having a meaning. And so there's meaning inside the words on the page beyond just the grammar and syntax. Like, that kind of approach to the text is crazy. And I find it interesting that, we can say that approach is ancient. Well, yeah, it's ancient, like 200, 300, 400 years after Christ, like well separated from the community that originally produced and maintained this textual witness to the circumambient tradition of the oral culture that created and was reformed by these texts. So I found that very interesting, and I don't know, put that in your pipe and smoke it, and then maybe share it with all your TikTokers. Yeah. I think it's really important for you to remember on page 28 the distinction that Longenecker makes with the rabbinic exegesis that spoke of this has relevance or that has relevance to this, as opposed to the Dead Sea Covenanters treating Scripture as this is that, because this will come up and that will come up, this and that, whether that is this or this is that, all of that will come up as we start talking about Jesus' use of the Old Testament. Did Jesus say that happened? And we can look at that and understand that happened, like we read Habakkuk, that happened to Habakkuk, and that had meaning for Habakkuk and his people. And as we translate that and interpret that, if we take it in the right context, it also means this for us. And so that has relevance to this, as opposed to saying, like the Qumran community did when they were in their Pesher on Habakkuk, when they said, no, that is this. The people suffering in Habakkuk, they are the people who were hurt by the wicked priest, and our teacher of righteousness has guided us away from that. Like, that is this. And so that is an important distinction to make. The rabbinic exegesis that spoke of that has relevance to this, as opposed to the Dead Sea Covenanters, a more Pesher approach, which says this is that. Just as a quick aside, backing up to page 25, Longenecker discusses Brownlee's analysis of 1QP Habakkuk and how different Brownlee thought it was from the Masoretic tradition. I use Brownlee as one of the major sources in my dissertation as I worked through Habakkuk, and I was trying to process a massive amount of information, and I'm sure there are things that slip through my brain that I didn't notice. But I honestly didn't find what Brownlee says to have found on page 25. I did not find the text of 1QP Habakkuk when it's actually quoting the text, not the Pesher part. Obviously, the Pesher part is not in line with the text, but the Pesher comes after the text, right? The Pesher first quotes the text, then says Pesher, or this is what it means. And when the Pesher was quoting the text, I found the text to be, it felt closer to the Masoretic text than what Brownlee seems to have found. And I didn't pick up on that. I don't remember picking up on that, but I'm sure I forgot. I forgot more than I probably even put in that dissertation. But overall, yeah, I did not find the Qumran text as it quotes Habakkuk to be radically different from the Masoretic tradition. There were definitely differences, but I didn't think that it supported the idea that the scripture text quoted in 1QP Habakkuk was dramatically far from the Masoretic tradition. Yeah. All right, let's look over to page 33. Okay, so on page 33, I thought this was interesting. I don't know if you picked up on this, if you read before you watched this video, but Longenecker uses Habakkuk 2:17 in 1QP Habakkuk as an example of allegorical interpretation, because they say Lebanon stands for the communal council and wild beasts for the simple-minded Jews who carry out the law. Well, we talked about that, and we saw that not as allegory, as if they were just conjuring this up out of nowhere, like we need to make this mean something to us, so let's just say that Lebanon is the community council and the wild beasts are the simple-minded Jews who carry out the law. Like we saw, look, comparing this to the Targum and multiple places in the Targum, that Lebanon was often translated as the temple, that this wasn't just it wasn't just a one-time allegory, and maybe it's not even an allegory at all. Maybe it was just a traditional interpretive understanding. It was kind of like a code in the tradition that they knew that Lebanon could represent the temple, and maybe it was because the lumber from Lebanon was used in Solomon's temple. And also in the Targum, it addressed the beast being killed. It wasn't just that because the animals were being killed as if, oh, these mean Babylonians, and they're just killing animals. The point is they were killing the livestock of the people, which had an impact on the people. And so they both saw what was happening to the animals as affecting people. And so maybe if we slow down and realize we're reading a product of an oral traditional culture that has a whole interpretive world mapped behind it, we'll come to different conclusions. Instead of just jumping to the conclusion, oh, this must be allegory, we can say what we see as allegory from our position was actually an interpretive world held in the hearts and minds of the community in something like a circumambient tradition of interpretation. All right, and that brings us basically to chapter 2. And I just wanted to give you a heads up on chapter 2. As you start chapter 2, it would help to remember some of the discussion from exegeting orality on Bultmann and form criticism. If you haven't had a class that's introduced you to the quest for the historical Jesus and all that scholarship, here's a very general overview just to give you a little context of some of what Longenecker talks about in some of the early pages of chapter 2. So beginning in like the 1700s, coming out of the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, there was this major shift in how people approach the Bible with the rise of rationalism and positivism. And positivism is this idea that we can know things for sure if we'll just be analytical enough, if we'll just be scientific enough, if we'll just be rational enough, we can get the hard data. We've got our printing press there so that we can copy and paste words. We can print the same words exactly the same way every single time. And so we can get our data right. We can provide our data exactly to everybody in the classroom. We can just learn everything positively. So scholars began to study the Bible through that lens, the lens of modern scientific certainty. People began to ask, well, who was Jesus really? What did he actually say? What did he actually do? We can't really be believing in these miracles. So whatever the Bible says about Jesus doing miracles, well, that's probably not historical. So maybe we can get behind all of the religious Christian theological beliefs, the Jesus of faith, and we can get back down to the Jesus of history, the historical Jesus, the real Jesus. That maybe sounds a little sarcastic because I don't think it's the best way to do things. Sorry. So many scholars brought these modern assumptions to the process. And form criticism then often imagined oral traditional communities as taking small pieces of tradition, stacking them together to create performances that told us more about the community's situation. I mean, they took these stories, these legends and myths and stories, and they put them together for them. And so when we look at how they put them together, that tells us more about them than it does about what actually happened. That's the idea of the Sitzim Leben, the situation of life of the community performing the tradition. So, for example, when Jesus says it's not what goes into the mouth that makes someone unclean, but what comes out of the mouth, a form critical approach might say, Jesus never said that. Though they might argue that the early church, debating whether Gentile believers should eat foods considered unclean by Torah, since that's happening, the church told the story about Jesus in a way that addressed the situation that was going on in the church. And so in that view, Jesus may have done or said something related to the story, but the form of the story we have now was shaped by the needs of the later community. And so what we're trying to do is sort through all of this Jesus of faith mess to get to the historical Jesus. And so there was this thing called the Jesus Seminar, I think like in the 1990s, and they had these criterion to try to determine whether something was something Jesus really said or did. And like one of those criteria was the criteria of dissimilarity. And the basic idea is that if Jesus is sounding too much like the Jewish things of the time, then Jesus probably didn't say that because he was breaking away from that. But if Jesus said something that sounds too much like the later church, well, then Jesus probably didn't say that because the church just put those words in his mouth. So Jesus has to, whatever's dissimilar, we know for sure that Jesus said that. And so what that ends up giving us is a Jesus that couldn't be Jewish and could never have founded the Christian church. So it's kind of crazy. So we should be careful with any method that makes it almost impossible for Jesus to sound like the world he came from, or could have possibly led to the movement that came from him. This also connects to source criticism and redaction criticism, source criticism tries to get down to the sources behind the texts we have. So, for instance, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they clearly use many of the same stories, sometimes seemingly verbatim, rearranged, shortened, lengthened. And so the idea is, as you start looking at comparing the text, we can see, well, did Matthew use Mark? Did Luke use Matthew and Mark? Basically, the consensus for a while, or at least I don't know if it's a consensus, maybe just a majority view. That's different than a consensus, right? But the majority view was that Mark wrote first, then Matthew, and then Luke, and there was a supposed Q source that they used also. So that's kind of source criticism. Where did these things come from? And then redaction criticism says, if we can find the places where material was added, and we can track that down to what the more original part of the text was. Problem with that is we're treating the text as if it was a text of modernity that's supposed to be copied verbatim, or else there's an error. But that's just not how oral traditional cultures actually work. That we have this text, then this text is blended into this text, and this text is blended into this text. That's not how oral traditional cultures work. They have this traditional material that they can draw from, and they draw from this material however they need to for the performance at hand. But this is the conversation that Longenecker is kind of launching into as he's beginning to introduce us to Jesus's use of the Old Testament, because we have to. The point of all that is, I'm gonna say this in the next video, but the New Testament's exegesis of the Old Testament begins with Jesus, right? Now it begins with Jesus from within the circumambient tradition, right? It begins with Jesus from within the whole world of the Old Testament stories and life system, but it begins with Jesus and interprets from Jesus, and a lot of that's going to have to come from certainly how Jesus himself used the Old Testament. But how do we see how Jesus himself used the Old Testament except by looking at the New Testament? So we have Matthew's words, Mark's words of what Jesus said. Are we certain that this is a reflection of how Jesus used the New Testament? And so this is the conversation that we're getting into here. So how do we know that Jesus said what Matthew, Mark, and Luke say he said? Well, as much as we know that there's a fluidity in how oral traditional cultures can communicate their words. What they don't do is make up their past to give understanding to their present. They will interpret their past in new ways and fresh ways to help them understand their present, but they won't conjure up a past that doesn't exist. The whole community knows their past. And so the whole community would say, that never happened to us. That never happened to our ancestors. That's not who we are. So while there's a fluidity, there's also a very strong stability in the text. And so that's how we can have Matthew, Mark, and Luke looking so different, but telling the same central story just with different emphasis. And so we can say both what we have in the New Testament in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the New Testament traditions under remembrances of Jesus's words. Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, not Greek. And we can also say that the apostles were more likely than not faithful preservers of the tradition of who Jesus was and what he said. So, as you go into these chapters, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I'd love to email with you. Even better, if 1, 2, or 3, or 7 of you want to get together on a Google Meet and let's have a conversation. And with y'all's permission, I'll record that and put that up for the edification of the whole class. That'd be great. As much face time as we can get in this class is the better. That's just my favorite way to teach. I think it's a great way to learn face to face instead of talking to my phone. It's not as fun.